Right, so I've put together something a bit different tonight. Normally on this channel, I'm rambling on about old sitcoms or cartoons from when we were kids, picking apart the little mistakes the animators left in by accident. Tonight I thought I'd do the same thing but with something a fair bit bigger. The Lord of the Rings trilogy. Fellowship, Two Towers, Return of the King. Somewhere around 12 hours of film, if you count the extended editions, which I obviously do because the theatrical cuts always feel like someone skipped a few chapters and hoped you wouldn't notice. I've watched this trilogy more times than I'd like to admit out loud to another person. Somewhere around the 20th or 30th viewing, you stop just watching the story and start noticing things instead. A car parked behind a hedge in the Shire. A bloke's contact lenses not quite doing their job. A sword that falls out of someone's hand twice during the exact same fight. None of it ruins the films, not even slightly, but once you've seen it, you genuinely can't unsee it, and I figured some of you would enjoy hearing about it the way I enjoy talking about it. So that's the plan for tonight. We're going through all three films, more or less in order, picking up continuity errors, the odd plot hole, a fair bit of behind-the-scenes trivia, and the kind of small stuff that only really turns up once you've watched something so many times you've lost count of the number. There's no countdown here, no ranking, nothing's building towards some big finale at the end. Just a long, slow wander through Middle-earth, pointing at things. If you're new to the channel, this is the kind of video you can just leave playing in the background while you drift off. Nothing's trying to keep you on the edge of your seat. There's no music sting waiting to jolt you awake. If you're out cold somewhere around the mines of M or E, that's honestly fine by me. You're not missing some twist at the end. There isn't one. Quick mention while we're here, if you do end up sticking around for the channel, there's a subscribe button somewhere on the screen. No pressure either way. I just like having you lot around for these. Right, let's start where the films themselves start. Before the Shire even shows up properly, before any of the hobbits, back when everyone in this story was apparently issued the same 9 rings on the same day, and at least one of them clearly didn't get the full briefing on what to do with his. The whole story kicks off with that big prologue Cate Blanchett narrates, the one explaining how the rings got made and handed out across elves, dwarves, and men. It's a properly grand way to open a film, and from what I understand, the studio actually wanted it trimmed right down, because they thought it was too much exposition, before anyone's even been given a name to remember. New Line fought to keep most of it, and thank goodness, because without it half of what happens later just wouldn't land the same way. Right, but mistakes, since that's what we're here for. There's a genuinely funny one tucked into the opening few minutes, when Ron strikes down Isildur's father, Elendil. The poor man gets thrown to the ground, and you can clearly see his helmet still on his head as he falls. The camera cuts to a wider shot a second later, and somehow the helmet's sitting on the ground, next to him instead. He hasn't moved, nobody's touched him. The helmet's just relocated itself while nobody was looking. Isildur fares even worse in that same stretch, and not just for the obvious reason involving his finger and a very large blade. As his body floats down the river afterward, robbed and shot full of arrows, there's a clear shot of his feet, and he appears to be wearing what looks for all the world like a pair of modern hiking boots, and hiking. Properly tragic death scene, several thousand years before the invention of rubber soles, and there's a bloke in the corner of the frame, dressed for a weekend ramble. There's another one, in that opening stretch I always find quietly funny. When the camera shows the 9 kings of men receiving their rings, they are simply shown standing with their rings, nice and solemn. Except one of them, off to the right of frame, just sort of stands there. Doesn't quite know when to lift his hand or when to put it back down. You can tell the poor extra simply wasn't given clear enough direction that day, and it made the final cut regardless. I like to imagine he still brings it up at family gatherings. Here's a small one that bugs me slightly more than it probably should, mostly because I notice typos for a living, apparently, even fictional ones. In the extended edition, before the Fellowship's even properly formed, Gandalf rides off to Minas Tirith to dig through the archives and confirm what he already suspects about Frodo's ring. He finds Isildur's old written account and reads through it, and there's a close shot of the actual scroll, while the black speech inscription appears as fiery letters on the ring itself. Problem is, it's missing a letter. The real inscription is meant to read Durbataluk, and on the prop it's written as Durbatluk, one vowel short. Completely irrelevant to anyone who doesn't speak fictional evil language, but once you've clocked it, you can't really unclock it. It's worth saying early on why a trilogy this beloved ended up with so many of these in the first place. All 3 films were shot together over roughly 14 months, almost entirely out of sequence, with crews filming scenes from the 3rd movie one day and the 1st movie the next. One long-running mistake tracking site apparently had Fellowship tied with The Matrix for the single most catalogued mistakes of any film on their books, somewhere around 192 of them. That sounds embarrassing until you remember they were juggling 3 movies worth of continuity simultaneously, with no easy way to check what a wig looked like 6 months earlier. Right, now, for the one most people actually do know about, because it's become a bit of a legend among fans in its own right. Later, once we're properly out of Hobbiton, there's the quiet little scene where Frodo and Sam reach the edge of familiar territory, and Sam says that line about being the furthest from home he's ever been. Lovely moment, except in the original theatrical cut, if you look just past the hedge in the background, there's a faint smoke trail and what looks suspiciously like a windscreen catching the light. It's a car, a modern, ordinary car driving past in the background of Middle-earth. What I find genuinely funny about this one is Peter Jackson's reaction to it over the years. He's apparently maintained on commentary that he never saw any car and has no idea what people are talking about, while other members of the production team have openly admitted, in their own separate commentary, that they spotted it, assumed nobody would ever notice, and quietly painted it out for the DVD release regardless. So you've got the director going, he has no idea, and the post-production team going, yes, we know, we fixed it. Make of that what you will. The untouched shot apparently still survives on one of the behind-the-scenes documentaries, if anyone fancies hunting it down. There's a smaller cousin to that one earlier in the same stretch, during the bit where Gandalf first rolls into the Shire on his cart, and a gang of children comes sprinting up behind him, hoping for fireworks. There's a point-of-view shot looking back from the cart, and down on the dirt road you can spot clear tyre tread marks, almost certainly left by a crew vehicle earlier that same day. Bit of an odd thing to find in a world that hasn't invented the wheel and engine combination yet, but there it is. Here's a fun detail while we're on the subject of just how hands-on this whole production really was. The trilogy apparently holds the Guinness World Record for the most false feet used across a single film series, somewhere around 1,800 of them, because every Hobbit foot you see on screen was a custom prosthetic that had to be reapplied fresh after each day of shooting. Same went for a lot of the ears. They were essentially rebuilding parts of these actors every single morning before anyone even said action. Knowing that makes the small mistakes feel almost more charming, honestly, because it's a reminder of just how much of this was done with actual hands rather than a computer quietly patching things up after the fact. Anyway, that's the prologue and the early Shire stuff covered. Since we're on the topic of the road out of the Shire, that's where things start getting properly interesting, because Bree is where the real continuity chaos kicks off in earnest. Since we're on the topic of things hiding in plain sight, Bree and the Road, just after, it give us a proper classic of the genre. When the 4 hobbits are hunkered down, under that fallen tree trunk, hiding from the ring wraith, watch the space around them carefully. There's clear daylight visible on both sides of the trunk, right above where they're crouched, which means the ring wraith, when he eventually appears, more or less has to materialise directly behind the tree, rather than walking around it the way a properly threatening dark rider probably should. Elijah Wood actually pointed this exact thing out himself on the DVD commentary, saying it looks like the rider kind of magically comes out of the tree. Nice to know even the actors were quietly side-eyeing the editing on that one. Back up a touch to the scene in Bag End, where Gandalf's questioning Bilbo about the ring. Before any of the Bree business even starts, keep an eye on Gandalf's belt through that whole conversation. It switches between being tied and just hanging loose several times within the same scene. Presumably because they filmed it across more than one take and the costume department didn't quite keep pace with itself. Small thing, but once you notice it, the belt genuinely becomes more interesting than the dialogue, which feels like exactly the sort of thing that happens to me on a 6th or 7th rewatch of anything. There's a lovely one involving an envelope, of all things. When Gandalf melts the wax to seal Frodo's letter, hands it over, and it gets passed around a few times across the scene, there are 5 separate shots of that same envelope. And in every single one, the wax seal is shaped slightly differently. One shape as Gandalf seals it, a different shape when he hands it to Frodo, a third shape entirely when Frodo's examining it alone after Gandalf's left, a fourth when Gandalf returns for it later, and a 5th shape as it gets tossed toward the fire. 5 different blobs of wax across 5 shots of one envelope, no 2 of them matching. I appreciate the commitment to inconsistency, honestly. Now a couple of small audio ones, because these always strike me as funny rather than annoying. Back at Bag End, Bilbo and Gandalf are sharing a smoke, and Bilbo blows a smoke ring that Gandalf watches drift across the room. Right after that, you can see Bilbo's mouth clearly saying something, except there's no audio attached to it at all. From what I understand, this is a leftover from a cut subplot where Gandalf was meant to be trying and failing to give up smoking. They trimmed the joke out but left Bilbo's mouth still moving from whatever the line used to be. A similar thing happens much later in Rivendell, when Frodo finally reunites with Bilbo and gives him a hug. You can hear Bilbo make this little delighted sound, except if you watch his mouth at that exact moment, it isn't moving at all. The sound's just sort of floating there, unattached to his face. And then there's Saruman revealing the Palantir to Gandalf, finishing his line about why they shouldn't fear to use it, except his mouth is still going for a beat, after the audio's already cut out. None of these ruin anything. They're barely noticeable, unless you're watching with subtitles on, and nothing better to do with your evening. Which, fair play, describes me on several occasions. Here's a nice bit of continuity that actually works in the film's favour, rather than against it, while we're outside the prancing pony. There's a background extra leaning against the inn wall, just a drunk bloke holding a carrot. Turns out that's the same actor who later shows up as an armoured Rohirrim soldier during the Battle of Helm's Deep in the second film, and then again as a pirate aboard one of the black ships in the third. 3 different costumes, 3 different corners of Middle-earth. One very busy extra, getting his absolute money's worth out of that contract. That's most of the road to Rivendell covered, mistake-wise. There's a smaller, almost philosophical one tucked in here too, which is that Gandalf's staff seems to come and go between scenes in ways fans have speculated about, something that becomes a much bigger conversation once we reach Orthanc much later in the trilogy. We'll get there eventually. For now, let's keep heading toward Rivendell itself, because the council scenes where the Fellowship actually gets formed, and there's a particularly good one involving a dwarf, an axe, and some genuinely baffling continuity editing. Rivendell's a lovely stretch of the film to just sit in for a minute, honestly. All those waterfalls and library shelves, and the sense that nobody who lives there has ever had a bad day in their life. The Council of Elrond scene itself is where the actual plot kicks into gear though, with representatives from every race in Middle-earth squeezed onto a few stone benches, arguing about who should carry a piece of jewellery to a volcano. There's a good continuity mistake buried right in the middle of it. When Gimli loses his patience and takes an axe to the ring sitting on its little stone platform, the axe shatters into several pieces on impact. In the close-up shot, you can clearly see the broken pieces scattered across the platform. Then the camera pulls back for a wider view of the whole council, and the pieces have vanished entirely. Cut back to a close-up again, and they're sitting right back where they were. The ring itself doesn't move an inch through any of this, which is obviously the entire point of the scene, but the broken axe seems to have a much more eventful afternoon than anyone intended. There's a smaller one in the same scene worth mentioning. During the close-up shots of the ring as Elrond explains what it is and where it came from, if you look closely at the reflective surface of the ring itself, you can catch a glimpse of the studio set ceiling reflected back. Small thing, easy to miss, but it's there. I do want to take a minute here to talk about the casting of this scene, rather than just the mistakes in it, because I find the story genuinely lovely. Viggo Mortensen very nearly wasn't Aragorn at all. Another actor, Stuart Townsend, had already been cast, had trained and rehearsed for around 2 months, and was then let go the day before filming started because Jackson felt he looked too young for the part. Mortensen himself almost turned the role down too. From what I understand, he was hesitant about the commitment, and it was his own son who convinced him to take it. Imagine being a teenager who talks your dad into one of the most iconic roles in fantasy film history, and just sort of mentioning that at school the next day, like it's nothing. He clearly threw himself into it once he said yes, by the way. There are stories about him staying in character so thoroughly that Jackson would address him as Aragorn during ordinary conversations off set, sometimes for half an hour at a stretch, without either of them really clocking it was happening. That's the kind of commitment that either makes a performance or makes everyone around you faintly concerned, and in this case, it was clearly the former. One more bit of trivia from this stretch of the film, since we're talking about background characters who quietly took on a life of their own. There's an unnamed elf extra who appears briefly during the council scene, played by Bret McKenzie, who you might know better as one half of Flight of the Conchords. A fan noticed him, decided he deserved a name, and christened him Figwit, short for Frodo is great, who is that? The nickname caught on so widely within the fandom that Jackson actually brought him back for a small cameo with an actual line of dialogue in the third film, purely as a nod to the fans who'd kept the joke alive. I quite like that. A background extra getting promoted on the strength of internet enthusiasm alone. There's also a line in this scene worth flagging, not because it's wrong exactly, but because it's going to cause a proper continuity headache further down the road. While the Fellowship's making its way through More a bit later in the film, Gandalf turns to Aragorn at one point and tells him that this foe is beyond any of you. Keep that line in the back of your mind. It's going to come back and bite the films rather firmly once we reach the very start of the second movie, and I'll explain exactly how when we get there. Right, since we're on the subject of More, that's where we're heading next, and there's quite a bit waiting for us in those minds. Before the Fellowship even gets to More, they try going over the mountain pass at Cuthrathras first, and there's a nice cluster of mistakes in that stretch alone. When Legolas spots the Crybane, those scout birds sent out from Dunland, and warns everyone to take cover, watch his eyes in that particular shot. They're brown. For most of the film, and for most of the trilogy generally, Legolas's eyes are a clear, striking blue. The reason for that is actually a nice bit of practical filmmaking trivia, rather than just careless editing. Orlando Bloom's natural eye colour is brown, so for most of his scenes as Legolas he wore blue contact lenses to match the character. Problem was those lenses scratched his corneas if he wore them too long, so he couldn't keep them in consistently throughout the whole shoot. Most of the time the production fixed this with blue contact lenses during filming, leaving his eye colour unchanged by any digital work in post-production. But in this particular shot on Cuthrathras, that fix simply got missed, and brown-eyed Legolas slipped through into the final cut. Worth remembering, because this isn't the last time it happens across the trilogy. While we're up on that mountain, here's a genuine bit of real-life trivia that snuck onto film completely by accident. During filming, Christopher Lee actually broke one of his fingers, Rather than push the schedule back to accommodate it, the production just bandaged it up and carried on as planned. And if you watch the scene where SIH Ruman summons the storm against the climbing party, the camera swoops past him at one point, and you can clearly see the heavily bandaged finger in shot. A genuine injury, hidden in plain sight during one of the more dramatic moments in the early film. Right into the mines properly. As the Fellowship approaches the secret door into MOE, Gandalf's leading the way, with his staff held out in front of him, glowing. If you look closely as he walks, there's a thin black cable trailing out from behind him, along the ground. That's the power cable for his staff's light, which the production team weren't quite able to fully hide on this particular take. Bit of an odd thing to spot creeping out from under a wizard's robes. Now the swords line. Remember that bit in the mines of MOE, where Gandalf tells Aragorn that swords are no more use here. He says this while they're crossing the bridge of Khazad-dûm, fleeing toward the Balrog encounter, and at the time, it plays as a properly chilling line. The wizard essentially admitting that ordinary weapons won't help against what's coming. The trouble is, the very next film opens with Gandalf doing exactly the opposite. The Two Towers begins with a replay of his fall into the chasm, and during the extended fight against the Balrog that follows, Gandalf draws his sword Glamdring and uses it repeatedly, eventually bringing the creature down after their battle on the mountainside. So the line that was meant to set up his sacrifice gets quietly undone the moment we actually see how the fight went. We'll come back to that properly once we hit the start of the second film. One more from inside the mines while we're here. When the cave troll bursts in during the chase through Balin's tomb and stabs at Frodo with its spear, Frodo falls to one side in the first shot. In the very next cut, his position shifted slightly, just enough that it doesn't quite match how he landed a moment earlier. Small thing in the middle of one of the more chaotic sequences in the film, easy to miss the first dozen times through. And finally, the one that always gets me a little, because it involves a sword with an actual job to do. Sting, Frodo's blade, is established early on as glowing blue whenever orcs or goblins are nearby, which makes it a handy built-in alarm system as well as a weapon. During the fight against the orc swarm in MORE, though, with goblins coming at the party from every direction, Sting just doesn't glow, not even slightly. Either the prop department forgot, or Sting clocked off early that day, and nobody noticed until it was too late to reshoot. That's more or less covered, mistakes and all. Since we're heading out the other side of the mountain now, let's talk a little about Lothlorien, because that's where things get properly tangled, geographically speaking. Lothlorien's one of those sequences that's almost entirely about atmosphere, rather than plot. All golden light and elven singing, and I think that's exactly why a couple of small mistakes managed to slip through without anyone noticing for years. As the Fellowship's departing Lothlorien by boat, Galadriel is seen riding in a small swan-shaped vessel across the river. If you look toward the left edge of frame during that shot, there's a crew member crouched down, clearly trying to stay out of sight, not quite managing it. He's just sort of there, looking around, in the middle of one of the more visually elegant moments in the film. A bit earlier, as the company first enters the Lothlorien woods, on foot, watch the ground beneath them. There are tyre tracks pressed into the grass, running along the path they're walking. Presumably left by some kind of vehicle used to bring equipment in ahead of filming, and presumably not something anyone expected viewers to be looking at the floor for, but there they are. Geography gets a bit wobbly here too, which feels like a strange thing to mess up in a story this carefully mapped out. Once the company sets off downriver in their boats, there's a wide shot showing the river flowing in a direction that doesn't match where they're meant to be heading, given they're on the western bank moving south toward a large waterfall. The water in the background is shown flowing the wrong way for that geography to make sense. There's a similar issue with the Celebrant River more generally, since several maps shown earlier in the trilogy suggest it should flow toward the east, putting Gu Ella Driel's whole realm on the opposite side of the river from where this sequence implies. None of it derails the story even slightly, but if you've ever sat with the actual maps from the books, as I have, regrettably, on more than one occasion, it does itch a little. Onward to Amon Hen, where the Fellowship finally splits apart, and where Bor Omir gets his proper send-off. During the duel between Aragorn and Lurtz, Aragorn gets thrown back against a tree, and his sword falls from his hand. Fine dramatic happens, except the next shot shows Lurtz pinning him to that same tree with a thrown shield, and Aragorn's sword falls from his hand a second time, despite the fact it should already be lying on the ground from a moment earlier. He's apparently picked it back up off screen, purely so the film can drop it again, for effect. There's a continuity slip during Bor Omir's final stand too. Right after Lurtz fires his first arrow, one of the Hobbit stand-ins is visible, just to Bor Omir's left, mid-action. In the very next shot, Merry and Pippin have repositioned to the opposite side of him entirely, standing close together, despite there being no real time for that kind of movement between cuts. Small thing, but it's the sort of detail that becomes obvious once you've watched the scene slowly enough times, which I clearly have. And one last one from the extended edition, since this is a properly funny addition to the chaos at Amon Hen. As Aragorn runs through the aftermath of the battle, past a field of fallen Uruk-hai, one of the supposedly dead orcs on the ground briefly lifts his head to look at the camera, then quickly puts it back down once he presumably realises he's in shot. Caught entirely by accident, kept in the final cut regardless. Genuinely one of my favourite small moments in the whole trilogy, an extra getting curious mid-death scene. That's Fellowship of the Ring done with, properly. 3 hours of film, a broken Fellowship, and a surprising number of background extras who didn't quite stick to the script. Since we're moving on now, let's talk about where Two Towers picks things up, because it opens by replaying that fall into the chasm we just covered, and it does so in a way that doesn't entirely match what we saw the first time round. The Two Towers opens by dropping us straight back into that fall through the chasm beneath Khazad-dûm. Gandalf, locked in combat with the Balrog as they both plummet into the dark. It's a great way to start a sequel, honestly, reminding everyone exactly where things stood before jumping forward to the rest of the Fellowship. There's a small but noticeable difference in how this replay plays out compared to the original moment in Fellowship though. Frodo's reaction, the moment he shouts out as Gandalf's grip finally slips, is timed slightly differently this time round, landing a beat earlier than it did in the first film. Possibly intentional to get the new film moving with a bit more urgency, but it does mean the exact same moment plays out two different ways depending on which film you're watching it in. And now for the bigger one, the payoff to that line I asked you to remember back at the Council of Elrond. Gandalf telling Aragorn that swords are no more use against what's coming, right before they fled across the bridge. Well, here's the full Balrog fight in detail for the first time, and Gandalf spends a good portion of it doing exactly the opposite of what he'd said moments earlier. He draws Glamdring and uses it properly, landing real blows, eventually driving it straight through the creature to finish things off. So the line that was meant to read as him accepting a hopeless, swordless fate gets completely contradicted the moment we actually see the fight itself. I don't think it ruins anything, the scene's still magnificent, but it is a genuinely odd thing for the script to set up so deliberately and then immediately walk back. Down on the plains of Rohan now, where Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli are tracking the Uruk-hai who've taken Merry and Pippin. In their very first scene together in this film, the three of them are shown sprinting along a ridge. And if you watch Gimli's feet closely, one of his boots actually comes loose and falls off mid-run. Nobody stops, nobody reacts, the chase just carries on regardless. Dwarves apparently have places to be. A bit further along, Aragorn comes across a riderless horse and calms it bareback, no saddle in sight. Fair enough, urgent situation, no time to be picky. Except a few scenes later, once he spots the orc army and starts galloping properly toward Helm's Deep, that same horse now has a full saddle fitted, with no real explanation for when that might have happened in between. Now, the one even Peter Jackson himself has openly acknowledged as a mistake, which I always find oddly comforting. The idea that even the director sat down afterward and went, "Yeah, that one's wrong." During the Uruk-hai's ambush by the Rohirrim Rim, Pippin's hands are shown bound the entire time he's being carried, right up until he and Merry manage to escape during the chaos. But in the middle of that same sequence, as a horse nearly tramples him, there's a clear shot of his hands free and spread wide near his face, not bound at all. Then in the very next cut, they're tied again. Jackson's apparently mentioned this exact discontinuity on the extended edition commentary himself, which I think earns it a small amount of grace, since at least somebody noticed eventually. Here's a fun production fact that actually explains a different oddity in that same Fangorn drop-off scene a little later. According to Jackson's own commentary, parts of that sequence where the Uruk-hai dump Merry and Pippin right next to each other, and Pippin then has to crawl some distance just to reach him, were filmed roughly 2 years apart from one another. 2 entirely separate shoots stitched together into one continuous feeling scene. Given that, the slight positioning mismatch makes a lot more sense than it first appears to, even if it's still technically there on screen. Right, since we're talking about Fangorn now, that's exactly where we're heading next, along with a stop in Edoras once Gandalf and the others arrive to confront Theoden. Merry and Pippin's escape into Fangorn Forest gives us one more small continuity wrinkle worth mentioning beyond the one we already covered. They're dropped right next to each other by the fleeing Uruk-hai, and yet Pippin then has to crawl a fair distance across the ground just to actually reach Merry and start talking to him, despite there being no real gap between them a moment earlier. As I mentioned, that's largely down to the 2 years apart filming explanation, but it's still a funny one to watch with that knowledge sitting in the back of your mind. Over in Edoras now, where Gandalf, Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli ride in to confront a kingdom that's fallen under Wormtongue's influence. As they approach the city on horseback, Shadowfax has a white rope visible around his neck in one shot. By the time they're riding through the streets themselves, past the watching townsfolk, the rope's vanished entirely, with no real moment where it could have been removed. Speaking of Shadowfax, here's a nice bit of practical filmmaking trouble, hiding just underneath the surface of these scenes. Shadowfax is established in the story as a horse so proud and wild that only Gandalf can ride him, which sounds great on paper, but is not actually documented as having caused a genuine headache on set, because the actual horse playing him wouldn't reliably accept a saddle or bridle. The production had to work hard to disguise the tack he was actually wearing throughout most of these scenes, hiding the saddle beneath Gandalf's robes and using a very thin, easy-to-miss bridle. If you watch closely in a few shots, you can actually see Gandalf's hand resting on the front edge of the saddle through the fabric, quietly giving the game away. There's a small armour mistake during Theoden's big speech in this stretch too, the one about the horse and its rider. While he's delivering it, Gamling is shown helping fit him with armour, and at one point the king's only wearing his breastplate. The camera cuts back to a wider shot a moment later, and he's still only wearing the breastplate, despite the scene implying a fuller process was underway. Not a dramatic mistake by any means, just a small gap between what the scene's trying to show and what actually made it into frame. One more from this stretch, involving Ayo Mare rather than anyone we've already covered. After he hands over 2 of Rohan's horses to Aragorn's group and turns to mount his own, his sword is briefly visible, sliding loose and falling away from its sheath. He doesn't react, the scene doesn't pause, it's just there for a frame or two before moving on. The kind of thing that only really becomes visible if you're pausing the film, which I appreciate is a slightly unusual way to spend an evening. And finally, a tiny one for anyone who pays close attention to hair, which I apparently am one of, given how many of these I've found over the years. Ayo-Win's hairstyle shifts very slightly between the shots of the group approaching Helm's Deep and the shots of them actually entering through the gate. Genuinely minor, the kind of thing that's really only noticeable in a side-by-side comparison rather than during an ordinary watch. Right, since we're staying in Rohan for now, let's head into Osgiliath next, because that's where Frodo, Sam, and Gollum end up after crossing paths with Faramir. And there's a fair bit waiting for us there too. Frodo and Sam's detour through Ithilien and into Mir's hands gives us a prop continuity error that connects all the way back to the first film, which I always think is a nice example of just how easy it is to lose track of a single object across a production this long. The Horn of Gondor, the one Boromir carried and which gets cloven in two during his death in Fellowship, has a rope attached to it for carrying. In that earlier film, the rope's clearly fixed to the metal loops on the half of the horn with a long mouthpiece. When Faramir's shown, holding the same horn here in the second film, the rope's instead attached to the loops on the smaller half, the one without the mouthpiece, despite there only being one correct way those loops were ever meant to sit. There's a flashback in this stretch too, showing Boromir addressing his men in Osgiliath before everything went wrong for him, and his horn keeps shifting position across the scene, sometimes tucked under his cloak, sometimes resting visibly over the top of it, without him ever actually moving it himself between cuts. Either Osgiliath had some genuinely unpredictable weather that day, or someone on the costume team kept readjusting it between takes without anyone noticing on camera. When Faramir's men eventually corner Frodo, Sam, and Gollum at the ruined sewer entrance, there's an edited continuity slip worth mentioning. As Faramir grabs Gollum and asks about Cirith Ungol, Frodo and Sam are shown watching the moment unfold, except their eyes stay fixed on the ground rather than tracking Gollum as he's seized. It's the sort of thing that happens when two separate shots, one of Faramir and one of the hobbits, get stitched together in the edit with Gollum's reactions added in afterward, and the eye lines just don't quite sync up as a result. There's also a smaller one involving Frodo's chain, the one holding the ring around his neck, during the final confrontation in Osgiliath itself. Across a few different shots while he's on the ground, the chain appears noticeably longer than it has been throughout the rest of the film, hanging well below where you'd expect it to sit. And the barrels visible behind Frodo and Sam during the earlier interrogation scene with Faramir have a habit of disappearing entirely between cuts, present in one shot and simply gone from the next, despite nobody moving them on screen. I do want to pause on one supposed mistake from this stretch that I don't actually think holds up, because it gets brought up a lot and I think it deserves a fairer hearing. During the Battle of Helm's Deep, which we'll get to properly in a moment, Aragorn shouts the order to fire at the approaching enemy, and some people have pointed out over the years that the word fire feels anachronistic for a medieval-style battle, since it implies gunpowder weaponry that doesn't exist in this world. Thing is, Tolkien himself was effectively translating an entire invented language into English for readers, choosing familiar words over constructed ones wherever it made the story easier to follow. Fire works the exact same way here. It's not a slip, it's a translation choice, and I think it gets unfairly lumped in with actual continuity errors more often than it deserves. Right, that's Osgiliath and Faramir's stretch of the film mostly covered. Since we're already talking about Helm's Deep, let's head there properly now, because it's far and away the busiest single sequence in the trilogy for these kinds of things. Helm's Deep is, by most counts I've seen, the single most mistake-heavy sequence in the entire trilogy, which makes a fair bit of sense once you consider how much was actually happening on that set. Hundreds of extras, night shoots stretched across months, rain machines running constantly, and a battle choreography complicated enough that keeping every single detail consistent across the whole thing would have been a genuinely tall order for any production. That same eye issue with Legolas turns up again here, by the way. Brown instead of blue for a good stretch of the battle. Same cause as before, the contact lenses simply couldn't be worn consistently. so I won't go over the mechanism again, just flagging that it's back. During the final breakout, when the surviving defenders charge out through the gate on horseback, there's a shot where the horse's hooves appear to pass straight through some of the fallen Uruk-hai corpses lying across the bridge, rather than stepping over or around them. A revealing little glimpse at how that whole charge was actually assembled, with the bodies added in separately from the horses themselves. Here's one I find genuinely fascinating because it's a leftover from a much bigger change made during the writing process. If you watch the charge of Gyan Dalf and the Ro Hir Rim arriving at dawn very closely, frame by frame, there's a brief moment where you can spot Arwen on her white horse, sword in hand, riding in among the rest. Early drafts of the film script actually had Arwen riding into the Battle of Helm's Deep with the Elven reinforcements, but that storyline was dropped long before shooting, and there are no leftover frames of her in the final cut of the Ro Hir Rim charge at dawn, a ghost of an entirely different version of the story, hiding in plain sight for anyone patient enough to scrub through it frame by frame. There's a small continuity mismatch around Gimli too, after he jumps from the wall and lands on top of an Uruk-hai below. In the close-up shot of him being helped up out of the water, it's clearly Legolas's arm reaching down to grab his shoulder. The camera cuts to a wider view a moment later, and it's now Aragorn doing the helping instead, with no sign of Legolas anywhere nearby. Aragorn's missing his elven cloak during a fair chunk of the battle too, despite wearing it consistently, both before and after, by the time he's welcomed back warmly by Awash. Once the fighting's over, the cloak's clasp is clearly visible on his shoulder again, suggesting that particular shot may have actually been filmed for an entirely different moment in the story and reused here instead. I'll end this section on a lighter note because it's one of my favourite bits of trivia from the whole production. Peter Jackson actually has a small cameo of his own during this battle, dressed in chainmail, briefly visible throwing a spear in the middle of the fighting. His own children appear nearby too, playing a couple of the refugee children sheltering in the caves behind the walls. A proper family affair tucked into the middle of one of the bleakest sequences in the trilogy. That's Helm's Deep covered, or at least the highlights of it, since you could genuinely spend an entire video on that battle alone if you wanted to. Since we're moving away from Rohan now, let's head over to Isengard, because that's where the Ents finally have their say. Esar Ruman and Wormtongue, looking down over the Uruk-hai army from high up on Orthanc, gives us a decent landscape continuity error, if you're the sort of person who pays attention to terrain, which apparently I am now. The ground in front of the tower is shown spread out fairly evenly across the plain in this shot, but earlier scenes had established that same area as heavily pitted and dug into, full of deep excavation pits where the army had been bred and assembled. The two versions of that landscape don't entirely line up with each other. There's a geography mismatch a bit further along too, when Fair Shugmir's company gets called back toward Osgiliath and pauses on a ridge to look out over the city. Mi Nas Tirith is visible in the distance from where they're standing, which would put them on the eastern bank of the river rather than the western side. Except once they actually reach Osgiliath itself, the dialogue makes clear that Emoar Dor's forces have already taken the eastern half of the city, which raises the question of how Fair Amir's group ended up on the western side so quickly without it being shown. The very final shot of the film has a geography slip in it as well, the camera rising up over Emi Nas Mor Gull to look out across Emoar Dor toward Barad-dûr in the distance. In that shot, the Dark Tower sits to the left of Mount Doom. According to the trilogy's own maps, shown earlier in this exact film, Barad-dûr should actually sit slightly to the right of the mountain from that particular viewpoint instead. A small thing, easily missed amid a genuinely striking closing shot. But it's there if you go looking. I want to take a moment here for an opinion rather than a mistake, because this one gets brought up constantly, and I don't think it's quite fair. People often point to the Ents being slow to get involved in the wider war as a plot hole, given that Fangorn Forest borders Rohan, and the Ents would presumably know what's happening nearby. But the film actually addresses this directly. Treebeard only commits to attacking Isengard once he personally witnesses the destruction Rumans caused along the forest's southern border, a moment the film shows us clearly leading into that decision. The Ents not already knowing isn't a hole in the story, it's the entire reason the sequence exists in the first place. Here's a properly funny bit of trivia to close this section out. John Rhys-Davies, who plays Gimli, is missing the tip of his left middle finger due to a childhood farming accident, which the makeup team disguised using a prosthetic tip for filming. According to a story that's done the rounds for years, Rhys-Davies once filled that prosthetic tip with fake blood, cut it open on set, and walked over to Peter Jackson claiming he'd had an accident. Jackson initially saw what looked like a small manageable cut, right up until Rhys-Davies bent the tip back and the whole thing burst open in front of him. A proper prank, played using a disability most people on set probably didn't even know he had. One last small thing before we move on, since people occasionally ask about it. Gandalf seems briefly surprised but then clearly pleased to learn that Sam went with Frodo toward Mordor after having already encountered Merry, Pippin, Legolas, Aragorn and Gimli by that point in the story. The explanation, as far as I can tell, comes down to his resurrection. Gandalf the White is the same entity as Gandalf the Grey, who died on the bridge, but the film suggests his authority, power and demeanour shifted somewhat in the process, meaning a few gaps like this are arguably intentional rather than careless. That wraps up the Two Towers, mistakes and all. Since we're heading into the final film now, let's pick things back up, right where this one left off, with the aftermath of Isengard still fresh and Frodo and Sam continuing on toward Mordor without him. The return of the King's Extended Edition opens by tidying up a few loose threads from the previous film, including Ruman's final confrontation with Gandalf at the base of Orthanc. And there's an editing oddity buried in that scene worth mentioning. Treebeard's shown escorting the group right up to the tower's entrance as the confrontation begins, but he then vanishes from frame entirely for the rest of the sequence, only reappearing once Ruman's body has already fallen from the tower above. Most likely a leftover from differences between how the theatrical and extended cuts handled the timing of that whole scene. There's a genuinely funny cluster of mistakes right after this, as the camera sweeps toward Adoras to check in on Rohan. If you watch the wide establishing shot carefully, the smoke from the chimneys is flowing backward, into the buildings rather than out of them. The flags around the city are fluttering the wrong direction for the wind shown elsewhere in the same shot, and even Éowyn's hair and clothing seem to be moving against rather than with the breeze. All of it points to the same explanation, that this particular shot was filmed and then played back in reverse, presumably to get a specific camera movement the production wanted, with nobody quite catching that it made the smoke and flags behave like they'd been rewound. Gandalf's staff causes a continuity headache again here too, in a different way than back in Fangorn. After Pippin warns him that Den Thor's about to burn fair Ymir alive, Gandalf's clearly holding his staff as they rush toward the Tomb of the Stewards. By the time they actually arrive, Gandalf's staff is not used, and Gandalf instead grabs a spear from a nearby soldier to fight off Den Thor with instead. The theatrical cut never quite explains the gap, though the extended edition includes a scene showing the Witch King breaking the staff during an earlier confrontation, which fills in the missing piece, if you've seen that version. Legolas's eyes do the brown and blue thing one more time here as well, outside the Black Gate this time, switching between shots depending on whether the digital colour correction made it into that particular take. Same cause as the previous two times, so I won't go over it again, just noting it's made its third and final appearance of the trilogy. There's a perspective oddity worth a quick mention too, right at the start of the confrontation with Ruman. He's shown standing on the very top platform of Orthanc, hundreds of feet above the ground, while Gandalf and the others stand close to the tower's base, looking up at him. Given how that height difference is established, the geography of how quickly they're then able to speak to each other at a normal conversational volume doesn't entirely hold together, though it's the sort of thing a film generally has to fudge a little for the scene to actually function. I'll close this section with a properly fascinating bit of design trivia, since it's such a contrast to everything we've covered so far in terms of how deliberate it actually was. Gollum's appearance went through several earlier concepts before settling on the version that made it to screen. One early design gave him skeletal, almost nostrilless features that the waiter artists found made him feel inhuman and unsympathetic rather than tragic, more like a zombie than a corrupted creature. Another scrapped version gave him a small potbelly. He was originally meant to be entirely computer-generated too, before Andy Serkis was cast, and the whole approach shifted toward performance capture, meaning the design had to be rebuilt again, around an actual physical performance underneath it. Right, let's head into the city itself now, because Minas Tirith's about to come under siege, and there's quite a lot happening within its walls. Minas Tirith itself is such a detailed, layered set that it's almost surprising there aren't more mistakes hiding in its background than there actually are. Early on, as Gandalf stands on a balcony, warning that the last defence of the city will be gone if Osgiliath falls, the buildings visible beside him shift slightly, in position between two consecutive shots of the same speech, suggesting the background plate used for that shot wasn't perfectly consistent between takes. There's a similar one a little later as Fair Ymir and his soldiers ride out toward Osgiliath with Minas Tirith looming behind them. Earlier shots clearly show trebuchets mounted along the city's walls, ready for the coming siege. In this particular wide shot of the riders departing, with the city directly behind them, every single one of those trebuchets has vanished from the walls entirely. Now, the one I genuinely call the most repeated, most visible mistake in the entire trilogy, the kind of thing that becomes impossible to unnotice once it's been pointed out to you. From around the midpoint of this film onward, Frodo has a scar low on his right cheek, near his chin, presumably from the various ordeals he's endured by this point in the story. That scar changes position and size constantly across the rest of the film, sometimes larger, sometimes smaller, sometimes sitting in a slightly different spot entirely. It even shows up on his left cheek in a couple of mirrored shots, most noticeably during the climb up Mount Doom while Sam's cradling his head. It's not subtle once you know to look for it, and once you've seen it shift the first time, you'll likely catch it doing so again throughout the rest of the film without even trying. There's a small-scale mistake involving Merry and Pippin too, after Frodo wakes up in Minas Tirith, and the two of them appear in the doorway to see him. In the close-up shot, their height reaches roughly the middle of an ornate carving on the door behind them. In the wide shot that follows of them running into the room, they appear noticeably shorter relative to that same carving, despite nothing in the scene suggesting either of them has moved further from the camera in a way that would explain it. Out at the Black Gate later, during the final muster before Aragorn's army marches on Mordor, there's a couple of moments where crew members are visible among the approaching ranks of orcs if you pause at the right frame. Easy enough to miss at full speed, given how chaotic that whole sequence is meant to feel, but they're there if you go frame by frame through it. Just a few people in modern clothing standing among the CGI horde. And finally, the Mumakil, those enormous war elephants the Haradrim ride into battle. In wide shots during the Pelennor Fields fighting, they're shown towering over everything around them, genuinely massive and imposing creatures. In a couple of closer shots later on, they look considerably smaller, not far off the size of an ordinary elephant, which rather undercuts the sense of scale the wider shots had worked so hard to establish. That's the siege of me nastir ith itself mostly covered. Since the Pelennor fields are where the real battle actually plays out, let's head there next, because that's where Ayo win and the Rohir Rim make their entrance, and it's another properly busy sequence for these kinds of things. Pelennor Fields is the biggest single battle in the trilogy, and honestly one of my favourite stretches of the whole story, mostly because of what happens between Ayo win and the Witch King. There's a small continuity gap right before that confrontation begins though, as the Witch King looms over the fallen Thay Oden and tells him to feast on his flesh. There's no Mumak carcass visible anywhere behind him in that particular shot. The moment Ayo Win steps forward to intervene, a massive dead Mumak suddenly appears lying just behind Thay Oden, despite not being there moments earlier, from the same general angle. The actual decapitation of the Witch King's fell beast has a small but genuinely well-spotted mistake hiding in it. As Ayo Win swings her sword to strike the creature's neck, you can see the cut already present on the beast a split second before her blade actually makes contact, suggesting the visual effect of the wound was layered in just slightly too early relative to her swing. A bit earlier in the same battle, as Legolas takes down an entire Mumak more or less single-handedly, climbing up its side using a length of rope while arrows fly past him, there's a shot where you can see his quiver of arrows clipping straight through the creature's CGI skin as he moves. A small reminder that for all the impressive choreography in that sequence, he was very likely climbing a large practical frame enhanced by green screen rather than an actual elephant at the time. There's a smaller, almost comedic one tucked into the fighting between two orc characters, Shagrat and Gorbag, back at Cirith Ungol, which technically overlaps with this same stretch of the story. Mid-fight, Gorbag's bald head is briefly visible without his wig in place, just for a frame or two, before the hairpiece reappears in the following shot as if nothing had happened. I'll mention one more, smaller and easier to miss, from the earlier hall scene where Elrond meets Aragorn in Edoras before Aragorn heads off toward the paths of the dead. There's a brief continuity blip there, involving the wind machines used on set that day. A small shift in how things are blowing around between two consecutive shots of the same conversation. Nothing dramatic, just one of those tiny production details that only really surfaces if you're watching with nothing better to focus on, which, again, fairly describes me. I want to end this section with a genuinely fascinating bit of trivia about how differently this whole sequence almost played out. In early drafts of the script, it wasn't Ayo Win who rode into this battle, disguised as a man to face the Witch King at all. It was Arwen. Within Tolkien's fictional history, Rohan began as land taken from Gondor's northern province, but he did not write Rohan and Gondor as a single combined kingdom at any point during the story's development. The version we actually got, with Ayo Win taking on that role, and the two kingdoms remaining distinct, only came together fairly late in the writing process, which makes the small leftover frames of Finduilas we spotted back at Helm's Deep make a lot more sense as a relic of that earlier version of the story. Right, since the battle's over now, let's head back to Frodo and Sam, because while all of this was happening, they were dealing with something rather worse in a cave, somewhere on the border of Mordor. While the armies of Gondor and Rohan were busy out on the Pelennor fields, Frodo, Sam and Gollum were dealing with their own nightmare entirely separately, and Shelob's lair gives us a handful of mistakes worth slowing down for. Through most of this stretch of the film, Frodo's face is noticeably dirty, smudged with grime from the journey. Once Shelob stung him, and he's left hanging unconscious in her web. His face is suddenly completely clean in that shot, before going right back to dirty again the moment he's cut free and the story moves on. Nobody seems to have popped in to wash his face mid-paralysis, so it's presumably just a difference between which take got used for which angle. There's a related continuity slip in the same stretch involving his eyes rather than his face. From Sam's point of view, looking down at Frodo wrapped in webbing and assumed dead, Frodo's eyes are shown wide open and completely still. The camera cuts to a side angle of Sam lifting him, and in that shot his eyes are closed instead. Then it cuts back to the original point of view, and they're open again, fixed in exactly the same spot as before. 3 shots, 2 different states stitched together as one continuous moment. Gollum's whole scheme to turn Sam and Frodo against each other gives us a genuinely fiddly little continuity error too, if you're willing to track it shot by shot. As Gollum sprinkles lembas crumbs onto Sam while he's sleeping, intending to frame him for eating their food, the grey blanket covering Sam shifts position constantly across the sequence. In one shot it covers him completely as the crumbs go on. In the next it's slipped down to his shoulder with only a bit of cloak showing. Then it's back up covering his shoulders fully again, with the crumbs now only visible on the blanket itself rather than on Sam. By the time Sam actually stands up, the blanket's on the ground entirely, and there are no crumbs left anywhere in sight, despite none of this being something Sam could plausibly have done while half asleep. Then, in the confrontation scene where Gollum accuses him, the crumbs reappear on his cloak instead, even though it was specifically the blanket they'd been sprinkled on earlier. A small disaster of continuity in service of a single petty lie, which feels almost fitting somehow. Frodo's necklace and the ring itself vanish briefly during Gollum's attack on the slopes of Mount Doom too, once Gollum turns him onto his back mid-struggle. His shirt's wide open at the collar in that moment, with no sign of the chain or the ring at all, before both reappear in the very next close-up as Gollum starts choking him. And then there's the one I find both genuinely clever and a little bit funny once you know to look for it, right after Gollum bites Frodo's finger off and they both nearly tumble into the lava together. As Sam reaches down to grab Frodo's hand and pull him to safety, you can clearly see Frodo's actual finger bent underneath itself, complete with the blood effect still attached, used to fake the appearance of it being missing. The illusion mostly holds up at full speed, but pours at exactly the right frame, and you can see precisely how the trick was built. I do want to take a brief, slightly nerdy detour here, because it's the kind of thing I genuinely think about more than is probably healthy. The temperature inside an active volcano, anywhere near an exposed lava pool, would realistically be far too hazardous for anyone to survive standing as close as Frodo and Sam end up once Mount Doom starts erupting around them, let alone for them to lie there afterward, calmly waiting for the eagles. It's not a continuity error exactly, more just a moment where the story understandably prioritizes emotional weight over thermodynamics. And honestly, fair enough. Nobody's watching that scene hoping for a more medically accurate finish. Here's a properly interesting bit of trivia to close this section out, since it changes how I think about that whole final confrontation between Frodo and Gollum. In an earlier version of the ending, Frodo was meant to deliberately push Gollum off the ledge into the fire himself, a more straightforwardly violent resolution that the production apparently felt comfortable with at the time, given how much audiences had come to despise Gollum by that point in the story. Jackson later described that version as feeling very un-Tolkien once they saw it cut together, since it ran against everything the character of Frodo was meant to represent by the end of his journey. The scene was eventually reshot into the version that made the final film, with Gollum's fall coming from his own obsessive struggle for the ring rather than a deliberate act of violence from Frodo. That's Shelob, Mount Doom, and the Black Gate more or less covered, which only really leaves the ending itself. Since the ring's finally been destroyed at this point, let's head toward the coronation and everything that follows, because there's still a fair bit of trivia and a couple of last mistakes worth mentioning before this one wraps up properly. Once Aragorn's properly crowned and the Fellowship's reunited on the steps of Minas Tirith, the trilogy starts winding itself down toward the ending everyone actually remembers, the long, gentle goodbye that famously goes on for what feels like several endings stacked on top of each other. I genuinely don't mind that about this film. After 9 hours of story, The characters deserve a slow walk out rather than an abrupt cut to black. And I think a lot of the criticism that gets aimed at the multiple endings misses just how much earned goodwill the trilogy's built up by that point. There's a small continuity hiccup tucked into one of the quieter, final scenes, back at Bag End, as Frodo finishes writing his account in the book Bilbo started years earlier. While he's wrapping up, he clutches at his shoulder, reacting to the old wound from the Nazgul blade he took back in the very first film. In one shot, he's holding the quill as the pain hits him. Sam then enters the room. In the next consecutive shot, Frodo's still clutching at the pain, except the quill's vanished from his hand entirely, with no moment shown of him actually setting it down in between. Here's a small one that technically isn't a mistake at all, though it gets mentioned often enough that I think it's worth addressing properly. There's a hobbit scene wandering around Hobbiton once the four travellers finally return home, who in the books had actually died some years before the events of the War of the Ring even took place. The films aren't under any obligation to follow the books exactly on details like this. Since adapting a story, this dense always involves some reshuffling, but it's the kind of small inconsistency that fans of the books in particular tend to clock immediately. I want to share a genuinely brilliant bit of trivia here, because it's one of those facts that completely recontextualizes a scene you've probably watched without a second thought. During the final battle at the Black Gate, Aragorn's shown fighting his way through the chaos at one point, and if you look closely at a particular shot, he appears to be battling a fairly ordinary-looking cave troll. What actually happened, according to Jackson, is that an entirely different scene was filmed for this exact moment, one where Aragorn fought a physical, fully formed version of Esso-Ron himself, echoing the prologue's battle between Esso-Ron and Isildur. By the time the film reached post-production, that confrontation no longer felt right tonally for where the story needed to land, so it was cut. Rather than waste the footage entirely, the production digitally replaced Esso-Ron with a cave troll and kept the rest of the shot exactly as filmed, meaning that Troll is, in a very real sense, wearing the choreography originally built for the Dark Lord himself. One more story before we properly wind things down, because I think it's a lovely way to close out this trilogy. 8 of the 9 actors who played the original Fellowship got matching tattoos partway through filming, the word 9 written out in Tolkien's own invented Elvish script, Tengwar, as a way of marking their time together on the production. They all went down to a tattoo parlour together to get it done. John Rhys-Davies was the one holdout, choosing not to get his done, so his stunt double stepped in to complete the set instead, meaning all 9 tattoos technically exist, just not all on the actors themselves. Sean Astin and Billy Boyd apparently had theirs done on their ankles specifically, as a nod to the sheer number of hours they'd both spent having hobbit feet applied and removed throughout the shoot. And finally, a small detail about Christopher Lee that I think deserves its own quiet moment, separate from all the mistakes and trivia we've covered tonight. Out of the entire cast and crew, across all 3 films, he was the only person who had actually met J.R.R. Tolkien in person, years earlier, by complete chance in a bar in Oxford. He'd read the books cover to cover once every year since they were first published back in the 1950s, decades before he ever knew a film adaptation would exist, let alone that he'd end up in it himself. Knowing that, his commitment to playing S.A.H. Ruman so faithfully across these 3 films feels like less of a job and more like something he'd been quietly preparing for his entire adult life without realising it. That's genuinely the whole trilogy covered now. Start to finish 3 films, a small army of continuity errors, and a fair few stories about the people who somehow pulled the whole thing together regardless. Since we're nearly done for tonight, let's just sit with that for a moment before wrapping up properly. I've got a handful of smaller ones left over that didn't fit neatly into the chronological run-through. So since we're nearly at the end anyway, let's just sit with a few extra stray details before wrapping up properly. Nothing here builds on anything else, so feel free to drift in and out as you like. Back in Fellowship, During the scene in Bag End, where Gandalf's first questioning Bilbo, there's a tiny prop detail involving his staff that's easy to miss entirely. In one shot, there's a small loop of leather wrapped around one of his fingers, presumably attached to the staff for grip. In the very next shot, that loop's simply gone, with no real moment where he could have slipped it off. Small thing, the kind of detail you'd only really notice if you were pausing constantly, which by this point in the evening I clearly was, repeatedly, across several different rewatches. There's a similarly tiny one involving the ring itself, right back when Gandalf first reveals its inscription to Frodo by throwing it into the fire at Bag End. He pulls it back out, drops it into Frodo's palm, and asks if he can see anything written on it. Frodo says no at first, then a moment later says wait, as though he's just noticed something, except the shot of the ring at that exact moment still shows it completely blank, with the actual glowing inscription only appearing in the following shot. So Frodo reacts to seeing something a beat before the film actually shows us anything for him to react to. While we're back in the Shire conceptually, here's a fun fact about just how much of these films relied on clever camera tricks, rather than digital effects, to make the height differences between hobbits, dwarves, and everyone else actually work. The production used forced perspective constantly, building entire sets at 2 different scales, using body doubles of matching heights, and sometimes simply having actors stand on boxes or kneel slightly, depending on what a particular shot needed. One especially tidy bit of casting luck meant John Rhys Davies happened to be taller than the 4 Hobbit actors by almost exactly the same amount Gimli's meant to be taller than them in the story, meaning the 5 of them could often be filmed together in a single shot without needing any extra trickery at all. Cate Blanchett wasn't quite so lucky playing Galadriel, since she actually had to wear a pair of tall platform boots underneath her gowns for any shot where her feet weren't visible, just to match the height of the other elf actors around her. Sticking with casting for a moment, here's a story I genuinely love. Sean Bean, who plays Bor O'Meara, was famously afraid of flying, and a number of the more remote mountain locations used for filming were usually reached by helicopter, which he avoided by hiking up instead. Rather than fly up with the rest of the cast for that shoot, Bean would apparently just hike the whole way himself, in full costume, taking around 2 hours to do it on foot that time. Dedication to a role doesn't get much more literal than choosing to walk up a mountain in armour rather than get on a helicopter for 10 minutes. Foot-related mishaps seem to follow this production around generally. Actually, now I think about it properly, Sean Astin reportedly cut the bottom of his foot quite badly while filming the scene where Sam chases after Frodo, trying to stop him leaving alone by boat. Dominic Monaghan, playing Merry, picked up a sizable splinter running toward Bucklebury Ferry in an earlier scene, which Billy Boyd apparently found endlessly funny at the time. None of these injuries made it onto screen in any visible way. They're just the sort of thing that happens when a production insists on filming in real forests and real rivers rather than building everything on a soundstage. And one final stray fact before we move on, mostly because I think it's a properly strange little footnote in the history of this story. Back in the late 1960s, the Beatles apparently wanted to make their own film adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, with John Boorman reportedly attached to direct. Tolkien himself turned down the idea of selling the rights for it, supposedly uncomfortable with the thought of a pop group taking on his book. It's a genuinely strange thing to picture, an entirely different cinematic universe where this story got told decades earlier, in a completely different style, by a director and a band who otherwise had nothing to do with fantasy filmmaking at all. Right, since we're properly deep into trivia territory now anyway, let's stay there a little longer, because there's a fair bit worth knowing about how differently this story reads on the page compared to how it ended up on screen. This last stretch isn't really about mistakes at all, more just the gap between Tolkien's actual text and what ended up surviving the trip to film, since adapting something this dense always means leaving things behind. I find this stuff genuinely interesting, rather than something to complain about. For what it's worth, 3 very long books into roughly 9 hours of film was always going to require some serious surgery. The biggest single cut is probably Tom Bombadil, a character who shows up fairly early in the books, living deep in the old forest with his wife Goldberry, entirely unaffected by the ring's influence in a way nothing else in the story really is. He doesn't appear anywhere in the films at all. Jackson's reasoning, from what I understand, was that Bombadil's sequence doesn't really advance the plot in a way that translates well to screen, charming as it is to read, and cutting him entirely was cleaner than trying to compress him into a few confusing minutes. The ending loses something fairly significant too. In the books, once the hobbits finally make it home, they find the Shire's been quietly taken over and industrialised under Saruman's influence while they were away, and the 4 of them lead a small uprising to liberate it themselves, called the Scouring of the Shire. It's one of my favourite parts of the books, honestly, because it shows just how much the hobbits have changed and grown through their journey, capable of leading a fight on home soil after everything they've been through elsewhere. The films cut it entirely, instead having Saruman die at Isengard rather than meeting his end back in the Shire, as he does in the text. Arwen's role shifts dramatically between page and screen too, in more or less the opposite direction from Bombadil. In the books she barely appears at all, mentioned mostly in passing and in the appendices, rather than playing any active part in the main story. The films expand her substantially, giving her several scenes of her own, a more developed relationship with Aragorn, and that dramatic ride to the ford with Frodo early in the first film, a moment that actually belongs to a different, much more minor character called Glorfindel in the original text. Swapping in a character audiences had already met made sense as a screenwriting choice, but it does mean an entirely different elf gets credit for the rescue in the books. Faramir comes off rather differently between the 2 versions as well. In the books, he's something of a moral contrast to his brother Boromir, someone who has every opportunity to take the ring for himself and simply doesn't. His restraint treated as proof of real strength of character. The films instead have him seriously consider taking Frodo and the ring back to his father in Gondor, only changing his mind partway through, which makes him feel a fair bit closer to Boromir than the books ever intended. It's not a mistake exactly, just a deliberate choice to add tension to that section of the story, though it does soften one of the clearer character contrasts from the original text. The Battle of Helm's Deep gets a notable addition for the screen too. The elves who arrive to reinforce Rohan's forces during that battle don't exist in the books at all, where the men of Rohan and Gondor hold the line entirely on their own. It's a striking visual on screen, allies arriving from a different storyline entirely to lend a hand, but it's purely a film invention, rather than anything from the original text. There's a smaller character change worth mentioning too. Awash, who leads the Riders of Rohan, is actually banished from the kingdom for a period in the books, exiled by Wormtongue's influence over Theoden, before eventually being allowed to return. The films simplify this away entirely, keeping him present throughout rather than writing in an exile arc that likely would have added more plot than the runtime could comfortably hold. Boromir's death itself gets shifted earlier for dramatic reasons too. In the books he survives all the way to the very start of the 2nd volume rather than dying at the close of the 1st, meaning the films moved his death forward by roughly a book's worth of story to give Fellowship a stronger, more emotionally complete ending of its own. And one last detail I find quietly striking, since it says something about the original text rather than the films themselves. By most counts, somewhere around 19% of the named characters across Tolkien's books are female, which the films don't really change either way, just inherit. Whatever you make of that number, it's at least part of why characters like Arwen and Eowyn got expanded roles on screen, simply because there wasn't a huge amount of source material to draw from otherwise. That's most of the book-to-film differences worth knowing. We've covered the story itself pretty thoroughly now, so let's spend a bit more time on the people who actually made it, since there's plenty of that left too. I've got a bit more production trivia left over, and since none of this needs to connect to anything else, it feels like a nice, gentle way to keep things rolling along before we properly call it a night. Think of this as the bit where I just keep talking about whatever I find interesting, with no particular order to any of it. Here's one that genuinely surprised me the first time I read it. John Rhys Davies, on top of playing Gimli throughout the whole trilogy, also provided the voice for Treebeard, the ancient tree shepherd who looks after Fangorn Forest. Rather than relying on any kind of electronic distortion to get that slow, booming quality the character needed, Rhys Davies simply spoke in his own naturally deep voice, pitched as low as he could manage through an actual wooden megaphone to give it that hollow, resonant quality. Entirely practical, no studio trickery involved, just an actor and a wooden tube doing the heavy lifting. Sticking with practical effects for a moment, here's a small detail about the ring itself that I think is rather charming once you know it. For shots where the ring needed to hit the ground and stay exactly where it landed, rather than bouncing or rolling off camera unpredictably, the production placed a small magnet underneath the floor of the set to hold it firmly in place. A tiny, completely invisible bit of stagecraft holding together one of the most important objects in the entire story. The autumn scenes get a similarly hands-on level of care. To keep the look of falling leaves consistent throughout a particular sequence, 6 crew members were apparently stationed above the set for the entire shoot, dropping leaves down at a steady, controlled rate, so the effect stayed consistent across every take. Once the leaves started to wither and lose their colour partway through filming, rather than source fresh ones, the crew apparently went through and repainted them individually, by hand, just to keep the visual consistency intact across what might have been weeks of shooting the same general area. Sound posed its own headache throughout the whole production too, mostly down to the sheer scale of the sets and the equipment running constantly during filming. Wind machines, rain rigs, and general set noise made it essentially impossible to capture usable dialogue live in most scenes. So the vast majority of the trilogy's spoken lines were actually recorded afterward in a studio and looped over the footage in post-production. There's one notable exception worth mentioning: Bilbo's rambling, slightly drunken birthday speech early in the first film, which was kept from the original live recording because Ian Holm apparently couldn't quite recreate that same loose, tipsy tone convincingly once he was back in a quiet studio sober. Music gets a brief mention here too, since Howard Shore's score across all 3 films is doing an enormous amount of emotional work throughout, often more than the dialogue itself in some of the quieter stretches. One small musical detail I particularly like involves Pippin's song in the 3rd film, the one he sings quietly for Den U Thor, while fair Ymir rides toward what looks increasingly like a suicidal charge. The lyrics for that piece were taken from the books, but the actual melody was composed by Billy Boyd himself, performed live on set rather than added afterward, which I think gives that particular scene a rawer, more unpolished quality than almost anything else in the trilogy. Swordwork deserves its own mention too, mostly because of how seriously Viggo Mortensen apparently took it. The production's veteran swordmaster, Bob Anderson, has been widely reported as describing him as one of the best swordsmen he ever trained, and Mortensen was known for often using real steel swords for his stunts and combat scenes rather than the much lighter aluminium or softer rubber versions made available for safety reasons. Heavier, properly weighted, and considerably more dangerous to everyone involved if something went wrong, but apparently it gave his on-screen fighting a weight and realism that the lighter props simply couldn't match. And a small, quietly lovely detail to close this section out. On the very last day of principal photography, across the entire trilogy, the final shot filmed was the moment of the newly crowned Aragorn bowing to the four hobbits in front of the gathered crowd. Mortensen technically didn't need to be present for that particular shot, since the focus was entirely on the hobbits bowing back to him rather than on his own face. He turned up anyway, apparently insisting on being there in person for the very last moment of filming regardless. Since nobody had thought to bring an actual crown for him to wear that day, he made one himself out of paper, just so the scene would feel right to him, even though the camera was never going to see it properly. That's a fair stretch of behind-the-scenes trivia, but there's a bit more worth knowing, particularly around casting, since a few of these roles very nearly went to completely different people. Since we're already deep into trivia, here's something I find endlessly fascinating about big productions like this one: the handful of casting decisions that very nearly went a completely different way. Gandalf, very clearly, was Ian McKellen all along. Sean Connery was reportedly offered the role first and turned it down, despite the offer apparently including a share of the film's eventual box office takings, alongside a flat fee, a deal that would have ended up being worth somewhere in the region of $400 million, given how enormous these films went on to become. Whatever his reasons for passing, and accounts vary on exactly why, it's a genuinely staggering amount of money to leave on the table for a role that ended up defining someone else's career instead. Christopher Lee, meanwhile, wanted Gandalf specifically, and apparently wanted it rather badly. He'd read the books every year since they were first published, and according to the story that's circulated for years now, he became so determined to prove himself right for the part that he started taking on smaller wizard-adjacent roles elsewhere in the 90s purely to demonstrate he had the look and presence for it. He's said to have gone as far as sending Peter Jackson an actual photograph of himself dressed as a wizard from one of those roles, half as a joke, half as a not-so-subtle hint about future casting. By the time he actually got into the room with Jackson, Ian McKellen had already been cast as Gandalf, which left Lee disappointed at first, before Jackson talked him into S.A.H. Ruman instead, a role he ended up embracing completely despite spending most of his career being typecast as villains. He was apparently rather tired of playing by that point. Aragorn very nearly went to two entirely different actors as well, on top of the Stuart Townsend situation we already covered earlier tonight. Daniel Day-Lewis reportedly turned the role down multiple separate times, much to Jackson's evident frustration, and Nicolas Cage was also approached at one stage, declining largely due to family obligations and a reluctance to relocate to New Zealand for the several years filming would require. It's strange to imagine either of their very different acting styles in a role that ended up so closely associated with Viggo Mortensen's particular brand of weary, reluctant nobility. But for a while, on paper at least, either of them could plausibly have been Aragorn instead. There's a smaller, funnier casting story tucked into all this too. Jake Gyllenhaal apparently auditioned for a role in the trilogy as well, though by his own account, it went rather badly, partly because nobody had warned him in advance that the part required a British accent. He's spoken since about going into the audition completely unprepared for that detail, with Jackson having to ask him on the spot whether he realised the accent was needed at all. By Gyllenhaal's own admission, it ended up being one of the worst auditions he's ever given, which is a nice reminder that even genuinely talented actors occasionally just have an off day in the room. And just to bring it back round to where we started this particular thread, remember Stuart Townsend, the actor originally cast as Aragorn, who trained and rehearsed for 2 months before being let go the day before filming began. It's worth sitting with for a second just how different this entire trilogy could have looked with any one of these alternate choices in place. Connery's Gandalf, Cage's Aragorn, an entirely different S.A.H. Ruman, who never gets the call at all. None of it happened, obviously, but it's the kind of thing that makes we appreciate just how many small decisions had to land exactly right for the films we actually got to exist the way they do. Since we're already deep into the trivia for the evening, let's stay there a bit longer, because there's a few smaller, more technical details left over worth mentioning too. A few more odds and ends here, none of them connected to each other, just a scattering of details I didn't want to leave out. Back in Fellowship, there's a small lore-based question that comes up reasonably often about Gandalf's staff specifically. After Sah Ruman strips him of it during their confrontation at Orthanc, locking him away at the top of the tower, Gandalf turns up later at Arivandel, holding a staff again, with no real explanation given for where it came from. The answer, if you look closely, is that it's actually a different staff entirely, distinguishable by the shape of the branches near the top compared to the one Sah Ruman took from him. Not a mistake so much as a detail the film simply never bother explaining out loud, trusting the audience to either not notice or not mind. There's a nice bit of practical design worth mentioning from The Fellowship of the Ring too, during the scene where a cave troll is brought in to break down a door while Gandalf's talking with Pippin about death and what comes after it. The tool the troll's actually using to batter the door isn't some fantastical invented weapon. It's a real blacksmith's plate-forming hammer, the kind normally used for shaping sheet metal, repurposed here as a believable-looking troll weapon. A small practical solution to a problem that could easily have gone in a much more elaborate, expensive direction. Here's a lore detail I genuinely like, because it answers a question that seems like a plot hole at first glance but actually isn't one. Bilbo's shown aging rapidly once he's separated from the ring after all those years of carrying it, catching up all at once on decades he'd effectively paused. Goll, despite having carried the ring for an even longer stretch of time, never visibly ages the same way across the story. The explanation comes down to how ring bearers are affected as soon as they possess or wear the ring, with those effects ending only once the ring itself is actually destroyed. Had Goll survived his fall into the lava at Mount Doom rather than going down with the ring itself, the implication is he would have aged and crumbled away almost instantly the moment it was destroyed. The same fate Bilbo experiences, more gently, after simply giving his up willingly years earlier. One smaller observation from the Edoras stretch in the second film, more of a logical itch than a true continuity error. As Aragorn tracks the orcs' marching pace alone across the plains, he and his companions later learn that an enormous force of Rohirrim Rim Riders has already ambushed the Uruk-hai near Fangorn Forest. Given that Legolas in particular is established throughout the trilogy as having exceptional elven hearing, capable of detecting far subtler sounds than this from a considerable distance, it's a little odd that neither of them seems to notice that many horses approaching until they're nearly on top of them. Not really a mistake exactly, more just a moment where the story needed a surprise more than it needed strict internal consistency. And finally, since we're properly winding down now, a few numbers worth sitting with, simply because of how enormous this whole undertaking actually was. Altogether, the three films took in somewhere around $2.91 billion at the worldwide box office, an extraordinary number for a fantasy trilogy that very nearly got condensed down into a single film before Jackson convinced the studio to commit to all three. Between them, the films collected a combined total of 17 Academy Awards, with Return of the King alone sweeping every single category it was nominated in. 11 wins from 11 nominations, tying the record for the most Oscars ever won by a single film. Quite the conclusion for a production that spent over a year filming in New Zealand, with crew vehicles occasionally driving through the background of the Shire. That's the box office and award numbers out of the way. There's still a handful of individual mistakes I haven't mentioned yet, scattered across a few of the bigger battle sequences, so let's pick through those next. I keep finding more of these the longer I sit with it, so here's one final cluster before I actually let this one rest properly. Mostly smaller bits pulled from the various battle sequences across the trilogy that didn't quite fit anywhere else in the running order back during the search for Merry and Pippin in the early stretch of Two Towers, as Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli comb through the aftermath of the Uruk-hai's camp. There's a shot of Legolas holding his bow where, if you look closely, only about half of it is actually visible, the rest seemingly missing or obscured in a way that makes the prop look broken rather than simply held at an angle. Easy enough to miss at normal speed, but it's a strange little visual once you notice it. A bit later, as the group's allowed into Edoras under instruction that no weapons are to be carried into Theoden's hall, there's a small sequence of inconsistency around exactly what Legolas hands over to the guards. In one shot, he's passing across the bow he'd been carrying in his hand. The very next close-up shows him drawing out the twin blades he keeps on his back instead, performing a fairly elaborate spinning flourish with them before apparently handing those over too, despite the moment feeling like it should have already concluded with the bow alone. Out at the Black Gate during the final battle, there's a nice bit of revealing CGI worth mentioning, as Aragorn and the others ride away from the approaching horde, shouting their final rallying lines before the fighting properly begins. The two massive doors of the gate itself are shown continuing to swing open wide in the background. Glance toward the top of frame during this same moment though, and you can still see the closed version of the gate visible just above the shadow line, suggesting two separate versions of that shot got layered together without quite lining up. During the Pelennor Fields charge against the Mumakil, there's a small but very findable mistake involving one of the Rohirrim Rim archers in the foreground of a wide shot. He fires an arrow toward the approaching war elephants, reaches back over his shoulder for another, and brings his arm forward again to nock it. Except no arrow is actually visible in his hand at any point during that whole motion. He's drawing and firing an entirely invisible weapon, over and over, for the whole shot. There's a similar revealing mistake involving A.Y. Omer in that same charge, his spear visibly bending and bobbing about with a strange rubbery flex as he rides, completely unlike how a real wooden spear would behave under that kind of motion. The rider directly behind him has the same issue with his own spear a moment later, both weapons behaving more like flags in the wind than solid weapons. That's the last of the battle scene details. A few more loose threads left before we're properly done, starting with a couple of small bits I missed earlier in the chronological run. Here's another small batch of things that didn't make it into the main run through earlier. Nothing urgent, just a few last odds and ends. Back near the very start of the story, in the scene where Sam gets caught eavesdropping outside the window, while Gandalf and Frodo discuss the ring, there's a nice, small prop continuity error tucked into the moment Sam admits what he overheard. As he's explaining himself, there's a map visible just under his right shoulder that disappears in one shot and reappears in the next, along with a small stack of fallen books on the floor nearby that shift position, slightly between cuts as well. Nothing dramatic, just the sort of detail that only really shows up once you've watched a scene enough times that the dialogue stopped being the main thing holding your attention. Over in Two Towers, during the evacuation of the women and children into the glittering caves behind Helm's Deep, there's a small revealing mistake worth a mention. In the very first shot of that sequence, a hooded figure leans against one of the stalactites hanging from the cave ceiling, and you can clearly see it sway back and forth under their weight, which it obviously shouldn't do if it's meant to be solid rock, rather than a lightweight prop. Here's a nice one that connects all the way back to something we covered earlier regarding Shadowfax. Remember the bit about how the actual horse playing him wouldn't reliably accept a saddle or bridle, forcing the crew to disguise his tack throughout most of his scenes in the second film? Well, later in the trilogy, in the Two Towers, there's a clear shot of Gandalf riding Shadowfax with his feet resting in visible stirrups, despite the character being introduced as essentially wild and untamed at that point in the story, answerable to no one. A small contradiction sitting quietly between the two films, depending on which one you happen to be watching. A nice bit of casting trivia while we're thinking about family resemblances. Sean Bean, who plays Bor Omier, and David Wenham, who plays his younger brother, Mir, were apparently chosen partly because they genuinely do look convincingly related on screen, sharing enough in their features and bearing that the sibling relationship reads as believable without the films needing to lean on it too heavily. It's a small, easy thing to take for granted, but plenty of on-screen family relationships fall apart instantly the moment two actors just don't look anything alike. And one last bit of trivia to close on, since I think it says something rather charming about how Jackson himself views these films. Despite the extended editions being the versions most fans, myself very much included, tend to treat as the proper, definitive way to watch this story, Jackson has apparently described the theatrical cuts as the true definitive versions in his own mind, regarding the longer editions as more of a novelty for people who want extra material rather than the version he considers complete. I happen to disagree with him entirely on this, for what it's worth, but I rather like that the person who made these films sees them slightly differently than the people who've spent the last 20 years rewatching them on a loop. That covers the last of the loose continuity threads from earlier in the story. One more practical detail before we get into anything reflective. Here's one more practical detail, and it ties in nicely with everything we've already said about how hands-on this whole production was. In the extended edition of Return of the King, right after the Witch King shatters Gandalf's staff and both he and Pippin tumble to the ground, there's a close-up immediately afterward as Pippin gets back to his feet. For a brief moment, as he lifts his leg, you can clearly see a perfectly ordinary white and black trainer on his foot. Completely modern. Completely out of place on a hobbit in Minas Tirith. Presumably, his actual prosthetic hobbit foot wasn't fitted yet for that particular take, or had come loose between setups, and nobody quite caught it before the shot made the final cut. It's a nice reminder of the gap between the size of the ambition on this production and the size of the mistakes hiding inside it, neither one really cancelling the other out. Weta Workshop reportedly built an enormous quantity of genuine wearable weapons and armour for this trilogy, far more than most productions would bother with, given how easily a lot of it could have been added digitally instead. And for all that obsessive attention to detail, somebody still occasionally turned up to set in their own trainers, or left a tyre track in the dirt, or forgot which way a wax seal was supposed to be shaped. Switching gears for a minute, away from mistakes and trivia entirely, I want to talk about a couple of moments in this trilogy that I think genuinely earn all the love they get, regardless of how many tyre tracks or contact lens mishaps are hiding around them. The lighting of the beacon sequence in Return of the King is one I could watch on a loop and never get tired of. It's barely got any dialogue in it at all, just a chain of fires being lit across mountain peak after mountain peak, calling for help across an enormous distance, scored entirely by Howard Shore's music, doing most of the emotional work on its own. There's something about the simplicity of it, beacon after beacon, catching a light as the camera sweeps across the landscape, that communicates desperation and hope and scale all at once, without a single character needing to explain any of it out loud. It's one of the quieter sequences in the trilogy for me, in a good way. The reveal at the Battle of Pelennor Fields, where Ayo Win finally turns to face the Witch King after he's just declared that no living man can possibly harm him, still gets me every time, even after more rewatches than I could honestly count. The whole setup of that moment, the quiet confidence he's carrying right up until she removes her helmet, is a properly satisfying bit of dramatic irony, built directly out of a piece of prophecy established much earlier in the story. It's one of the few moments in the trilogy where the payoff actually matches the build-up around it. And then there's the quieter one, near the end of the second film, Sam's speech to Frodo in the ruins of Osgiliath, about why people keep going, even when everything in a story seems lost. It's a small, simple piece of writing compared to the battles surrounding it on either side. And yet it's the bit of dialogue from this trilogy I find myself thinking about most often at random points during an ordinary week, that has nothing to do with hobbits or rings at all. There's something about hearing that sentiment from the character who spent the whole story just quietly, stubbornly, refusing to leave his friend's side that makes it land harder than it probably would coming from anyone else. I don't think any of this needs much more explaining than that, honestly. Sometimes it's worth just naming the bits that work well, rather than only cataloguing the bits that slipped through slightly wrong. Two more small things, genuinely the last of them, since they're more about what got left out of the theatrical cuts entirely, rather than mistakes within what actually made it to screen. The mouth of SOW Ron, a fairly unsettling messenger character who appears before the Black Gate to taunt Aragorn's forces and produce what looks like Frodo's mithril shirt as proof of his capture, was filmed for Return of the King but cut entirely from the theatrical release, only restored in the extended edition. Test audiences apparently found the character and the prosthetic work involved more distracting than effective, so Jackson trimmed the whole exchange down to a single moment where Aragorn simply beheads him without a word, rather than keeping the longer dialogue scene intact for the original cinema release. There's also a long-running bit of fan debate around why the giant eagles, who do eventually show up to rescue Frodo and Sam from Mount Doom, don't simply fly the ring there in the first place and skip the entire journey. It's the sort of question that comes up constantly enough that Tolkien fans have spent literal decades arguing about it, with explanations ranging from SOW Ron's ability to see and strike down anything flying openly over Mordor, to the eagles generally being reluctant to involve themselves directly in the affairs of other races except as an absolute last resort. The films don't really address it either way, content to let the eagles arrive exactly when the story needs them, and not a moment sooner. Right, that's the last of the trivia. So that's the trilogy, more or less picked apart and put back together again over the course of one very long evening. I hope some of it landed the way I wanted it to, not as a list of complaints about films I clearly adore, but just as the kind of thing you notice when you've spent enough hours with a story that it starts feeling less like something you watch and more like somewhere you've actually been. I think what I like most about going through all of this isn't really the mistakes themselves, if I'm honest. It's more the reminder of just how much actual human effort sits underneath something this enormous. Real crew members ducking out of frame, real injuries bandaged up and carried on through. An actor making himself a paper crown because the moment mattered to him, even if the camera was never going to see it. All of that sitting alongside a car that drove through the background of the Shire and a contact lens that scratched somebody's eye one afternoon in New Zealand. It's a strange, lovely mix of the deeply careful and the completely accidental, and somehow it still adds up to something that's held up for over 20 years now. If you're still awake at this point, fair play to you genuinely, and if you drifted off somewhere back around Helm's Deep, that's exactly what this was for, so no complaints from me either way. I've got a few more of these kinds of videos rattling around in my head for the future, possibly something on the Hobbit films at some point, possibly something else entirely, depending on what I end up rewatching next. No promises on when, just know it's the sort of thing I'll probably end up doing again before too long. For now though, that's me done for the night. Sleep well, and I'll see